Hi, my name is Chris M. Slawecki. I'm the Senior Digital Copy Editor for DIA, and today I'm honored to welcome Dan Riskin into the DIA Media booth at our DIA Global Annual Meeting 2022 in Chicago. Dan, thank you for making time to be here today. Welcome.
Thank you, Chris. It's a pleasure to be here, and I look forward to talking with the audience.
Dan, would you please share for us, as the founder, your vision for Verantos?
Sure. Um, I started the company and began operations in 2015. I had worked on national policy, testifying before Congress on 21st century cures, and thinking through what it would mean to start using routinely collected data to create a learning health system. We were discussing at the time real world evidence and the hope that we would be able to use routinely collected data to tailor therapy to enable precision medicine. The fear was that we would use bad data and bad technology, come up with bad answers, and harm patients. And as I thought through this, and with a background in building companies and applying health artificial intelligence, I thought this was a place I could make a real difference to implement better data, better technology to try to learn from routine care in a high validity way. We call it high validity real world evidence at scale, and we've really spent the last 7 years trying to do that.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you. I'd like to go a little bit into more detail as to specifically why you're here in Chicago. Dan is here to chair the session that was titled Regulatory Grade Real World Evidence, Distilling to Practice. And so, Dan, I'd like to give you the opportunity for the folks who couldn't be in Chicago. What topics did this session focus on, and why are these topics important as we sit here in 2022?
We have spent years trying to distill to practice high validity real world evidence at scale. What it requires is bringing together electronic health record data, technologies that can go into the narrative, such as natural language processing and AI-based inference, and linked data such as facility claims, pharmacy claims, and death registry. We spent years trying to bring these together in a way that we can get the right answer. High accuracy and completeness from data to be able to say, this drug works better than that drug in this subgroup, or this drug has high effectiveness in this way. We've been trying to get the answers out of routine care, and it's not easy to do it. The panel, the focus of the panel is, what does it mean to distill this to practice? What does it mean to work with health systems and to bring together linkage and to apply advanced technologies? And we share examples that we've worked on with the large pharmaceutical firms to actually deploy this. Now, the term regulatory grade is a little bit of a challenge. It implies that we're only using this for regulatory use, and that's not the case.
Okay.
Whether a pharmaceutical firm is making a clinical argument to a regulator or a payer or a provider to change the way that they approve or reimburse or prescribe, it's important that they actually have high validity evidence to make those decisions. That's how we protect patients.
As a writer, I love the word distilling because it implies to me a process of purification, of removing impurities and imperfections, and getting down to the essence. So just as a writer, I love the subtitle of your session. Thank you. You also that response also set us up really nicely for a larger conversation. And you've intimated at parts of this already, but I'd kind of would just like to talk it out for context for the next part of this interview. Over the last, say, 10 years or so, we've seen drug research and development turn from what was traditionally a linear cycle wouldn't be the word, a linear framework would be the word, where you had distinct go, no-go decisions between phase 1 and phase 2, and then phase 2 and phase 3. And then at the end of your clinical trial, you would send truckloads of paper down to Cedar, and if you were lucky, you would get a regulatory approval on your label, and then you would take your label to the healthcare system or to a payer and say, please put us on your formulary, or please put this product in your system. It was always at the end of the development cycle. Somewhere over the last 10 years, we've seen that model change. And I would like to suggest that the first place that we saw that change was patient engagement, where we saw scientists collaborating with patients and patient representatives in designing phase 2 trials or phase 3 trials. What are the endpoints you want to see? What does recovery or prevention look like to you in this disease? But then that model changed, and now we see scientists designing phase 2 or 3 clinical trials, talking to payers and asking them, how do I design this trial so that it gives you the evidence you want to see to make you more comfortable accepting this product into your healthcare system? Or more to a point you made previously, we see companies using artificial intelligence or machine learning to mine electronic health records or even pharmacovigilance data to try to identify more narrow patient populations and then feed that back to people designing subsequent clinical trials to get more narrow, more clearly defined, more accurate patients in these trials, to get better instructions for patients on the label. What used to be a straight line process is now becoming a loop. And a big driver behind forming that loop was digitalization of data. And so first, I want to thank you for letting me go off like that. But second, I'd like to give you the opportunity to just share your perspective on how that straight line is not so straight anymore.
Well, let's take a step back to when evidence-based medicine was really coming into its own. This is 50 years ago, where there were very few drugs approved, and most patients were fairly simple. They had one disease, maybe two diseases. Fast forward 50 years later, now, and there have been thousands of drugs approved. Many diseases have multiple drugs available, and many patients have multiple diseases, so they're complex. This is a outcome of success in the healthcare industry. It's created a challenge because the goal of evidence-based medicine 50 years ago, which was to understand safe and effective, is no longer sufficient. Now we need to understand safe and more effective in whom, because the doctors have many choices for a given disease, and because the patients have multiple characteristics that could influence how they respond. And so now we need to go beyond the limited amount of information in randomized trials and say, how do we actually get answers to these hard questions? Safe and more effective in whom? Fortunately, the trends are in our favor. As of the HITECH Act and a lot of money that the US spent to get data into health records, into electronic form, and as of the advent of the cloud over the last decade with massive compute power, and the emergence of artificial intelligence with incredible technology capabilities, we fortunately have the solution to the problem just as we need it. And so the solution becomes using the rest of the data. It turns out that just having a tiny fraction of the data from RCTs can never get you enough power to know what works better in whom. It can never get you subgroups. And so if we apply AI and cloud technologies to newly available electronic data, we can understand in routine care what is working and what is not working. And we create a learning health system where we influence through the stages of development and through commercialization the actual design of trials, all the way to the decisions of payers and the decisions of providers to achieve the highest effectiveness in the right subgroups.
I love that phrase, a learning health system.
We
Just love that
try.
phrase. I
We
love that
try,
phrase.
and
It's
it's not
fantastic.
new. This is something that has been envisioned by the Institute of Medicine for 2 decades. And the idea of using routine data from learning, not just at an individual doctor level, this worked for my last patient, so I'm using it on the next one, but an aggregation of doctors and patients to see what worked and didn't work to change the way medicine is practiced. This has been a holy grail for 2 decades. And now, as of last year, this year, we're finally in a position to actually make it happen in a way that's believable and good for patients.
Excellent. And that is a great setup to drill down a little bit into 2 specific subtopics in your session. One, I'm actually really excited about them both because they're really pretty important. The first one is that one of the subtopics was examining how RWE can complement randomized clinical trials, which you just said, by addressing information gaps. So what I want to ask you is, on a summary level, what type of information gaps are we discovering using the randomized clinical trial model? And how is real-world evidence, how, where, and why do those gaps exist? And similarly, how, where, and why can RWE address those gaps?
So we need to take a step back and look at what a trial is designed to do. A trial is a controlled environment with heavy resources and a narrow population, and it's designed to understand efficacy. And in as much as you're understanding efficacy in a trial, RWE should not replicate that. RWE is designed to look at effectiveness, an uncontrolled population, a non-intervention, less resources. So what happens to those patients? So RWE and RCTs are not trying to accomplish the same thing.
Okay.
Now, you might, in a rare population, use RWE to create an external control arm because there's no other way to run the trial.
Right.
That's perfectly reasonable. Or you might try to extend a trial by saying, we have funding for 5 years, but in the consent, we'll ask the patient to allow us to follow them in a pragmatic way using the EHR and claims data to follow for an extra 5 years.
Okay.
And companies like ours, like Verantos, might help with that. The use of real-world evidence to augment a trial is perfectly reasonable when done properly. It should not be used to replicate a trial because it's not looking at efficacy, it's looking at effectiveness. The other form of complementing a trial is to say, well, a trial is very useful to get approval and to define a label, and a trial can say that a drug will work in a narrow population, but when you're out in the market, there are patients that will benefit more and benefit less from the treatment. It's clearly in the patient's best interest to find that out. Pharmaceutical firms have at times not wanted to invest in these subgroups because obviously it's better to look at a broad population and have a broad label.
Yeah.
The challenge is with multiple therapies available, doctors are not prescribing at high levels to a broad label when there are multiple therapies available. And so the way that pharmaceutical firms will differentiate their treatment is going to be to test the subgroups and say, my treatment works best in this group. It might be a patient with these comorbidities or from this background. My treatment in the real world works best in this group. That is phenomenally powerful for the patient.
Right.
It's also powerful for a pharmaceutical firm that might have 1% penetration on their label, but in a subgroup where they're particularly effective, might have 20% penetration if they can really prove to the provider market and to the payers that this drug is highly effective. Not high efficacy, high effectiveness in this population when used in the real world. That's powerful, and that's the direction the top pharmaceutical firms have been going over recent years.
The next subtopic, I believe you've already begun to address it, and it's so important. Access. It is just an issue in every healthcare system, in every market. Uh, Sometimes it takes too long. Sometimes things are too expensive. Sometimes, well, there's a myriad of reasons why access can be an issue. How does RWE fit into the access equation?
So historically, um, pharmaceutical firms have broken out their evidence generation to regulatory, market access, and medical affairs. Increasingly, when we are asked to implement high validity real world evidence,
Hmm.
we are being asked to enable regulatory, market access, and medical affairs needs. So it's no longer about um, which audience you're working with, it's about the research question. If the research question is clinical, you want high validity, and you're willing to spend to get high validity data and evidence to answer that question.
Right.
So we're seeing increasingly those silos breaking down in the pharmaceutical firms,
Okay.
and increasingly the evidence being used for regulators, payers, and providers. When we think about access for patients, they need the regulators to approve, the payers to reimburse, the doctors to prescribe. We also want to understand those patients not just from the RCT, but to understand their background. And this is where we run into challenges in RCTs of diversity.
Mm,
So an RCT may miss entire populations because it's primarily based in a quaternary care referral center. So in as much as we can gather real world evidence from care in real places where real people are getting care, not these very narrow institutions that are
right.
referral centers,
Right.
then we see a diversity of population consistent with the populations being treated. We get answers and evidence of how it's working in that population, and we can actually properly prescribe with evidence.
Right.
And that's the ultimate form of access.
Right.
So getting regulators to approve, payers to reimburse, providers to prescribe is one important component. But the second component of having the evidence reflect the actual population,
Hmm.
it's something that trials have struggled with, but real world evidence is particularly well suited to achieve.
Right. Right. That's just a fantastic answer. I really want to thank you for that. That's just a
Thank you.
fantastic answer. Um, you've done just a great job kind of summarizing the state of your work. May I ask you to look forward for a moment? And we're all going to eventually go home from Chicago. In the talk of this digital virtuous loop, where and how will your next steps, where and how does it fit into that? And then if I can add on to that, for our watchers and our listeners, 2 or 3 years from now, when you and I are having this conversation again, what will be different about it? What can our watchers, our listeners expect to change in the next 2 or 3 years? Thank you.
Well, I'm so excited about the future. I think I'll start with a longer time horizon
Okay.
and then go down to the shorter. I talked about 50 years ago when evidence-based medicine was really coming to the fore. And the last 50 years have been spectacular, where we have moved from medicine as an art to medicine as a science. The next 50 years are so exciting because we have an opportunity to use data to create a learning health system to enable precision medicine, tailored therapy, where we will actually understand a patient, we will find similar patients, and we will know what will work best in them. We have never had that in the health system to date.
Yeah.
And so the next 50 years of creating precision medicine and tailored therapy using data and technology is really exciting. With that said, I don't think it's going to take 50 years to see benefits.
Okay.
And so we can look over the next 20 years and expect that we will be treating patients in subgroups that are uniquely characterized based on real-time data coming out of the system. We can look at the next 10 years and we can expect that increasingly publications will focus in what is more effective and in whom. And we can look at the next 5 years and say, okay, pharmaceutical firms which today have siloed regulatory, market access, and medical affairs we'll
Right.
integrate them, we'll fund a new generation of science to enable more and more real world evidence to be created, and we'll push toward higher validity evidence where we actually measure accuracy, completeness, and traceability, which are FDA standards in their
Right.
draft guidance, according
Okay.
to what is good in real world evidence. And the pharmaceutical firms will work with vendors like ours that focus on accuracy, completeness, and traceability, that bring together the technologies and actually test with the gold standard, measure accuracy, link data sets for completeness, and do the hard work required for that high validity evidence to be created. And in the next 2 years, when you and I catch up in 2 years, my expectation is we will say that a number of the top 10 firms have invested to work internally and to work with the vendors that focus exclusively on high validity so that we can be a learning industry, not just a learning health system, but as an industry we're learning to do things we've never done before.
I can't imagine a better way to close. Uh, Looking forward to the future and doing things that we've not been able to do before. I really enjoyed this conversation, sincerely. Thank you for being here today.
Thank you, Chris.
Thank you for contributing to our global annual meeting, and best of luck when you get back home from Chicago.
We appreciate it, and I thank you so much for taking the time to listen to us. We work to make the industry better. We work to benefit patients. And as long as we all keep that in mind, I think we can do spectacular things.
For DIA, I am Chris M. Slowacki.